On the morning of November 19th, 1999, Carolyn Stahl had an extra bright smile on her face as she saw her patients at her eye clinic in Long Beach, California. Sure, it was another busy and hectic Friday, but it was also Carolyn's 44th birthday, and her husband Ken was going to take her out to dinner the next night to celebrate. In many ways, Carolyn and Ken Stahl were a classic Orange County power couple. She was an optometrist, and he was an anesthesiologist at a nearby hospital. They lived in a condo in a gated community, and Carolyn's interior design talents had made their home the envy of all their friends. And with no children at home, Carolyn and Ken liked to spend their money on things like expensive clothes, travel, and extravagant hobbies, like Ken's antique sword collection. But even with all that wealth, Carolyn had always remained down to earth. She was sweet to her friends, and she remembered their birthdays and other special occasions with cards and gifts. She talked to her mother back in her native Michigan at least twice a week, and she was planning a trip back home for the holidays to see her. And Carolyn took special care of Ken and always made sure he had whatever he needed. Carolyn even picked out the seeds from Ken's watermelon because she knew he couldn't stand them. Carolyn remained in a great mood that day as she gave eye exams to one patient after another. And it was the first time in a while she'd felt like everything was going well in her life, because she and her 57-year-old husband, Ken, had been through a lot that year. Ken had been having heart problems, and a few months earlier, he had undergone an 8-hour operation to restore proper blood flow. The surgery had left Ken feeling weak and depleted for months in a way Carolyn had never seen before. Carolyn knew that bad hearts ran in Ken's family. His father had died from a heart attack, so she really didn't take her time with her husband for granted. And recently, Ken had finally started feeling much better, and he told Carolyn how excited he was to go out with her for her birthday, and so Carolyn was so excited. Ken planned to take them to a Mexican restaurant in the pretty town of San Juan Capistrano, and then after dinner, they'd go on a romantic stroll near the historic Spanish mission in the area, and Carolyn thought this was a perfect way to celebrate her birthday, and to celebrate a new start for the couple. The following day, Saturday, November 20th, Ken was busy getting ready for his and Carolyn's big night out, and he really wanted everything to go perfectly. If Carolyn was sweet and sociable, Ken was intense and ambitious. He always felt like he was following in his father's footsteps and not quite measuring up. Ken was the only son of a prominent anesthesiologist who had once owned a hospital and made the news all the time. By comparison, Ken had only managed to get himself appointed to an obscure medical board, and he never seemed to fly quite as high as his father. Ken was really close to his mother, but he suspected that even she thought his career was less impressive than his father's had been. Ken also had this growing sense that he was running out of time. He worked out like a maniac to stay fit, and routinely went on 25-mile hikes and day-long bike rides. He was naturally athletic and had gone to college on a football scholarship, but Ken knew he had very likely inherited his father's heart problems, and so he was unlikely to live to a ripe old age. But this really only served to make Ken more driven to succeed in the time that he had. But on that particular Saturday, as Ken got ready, he actually found himself feeling quite relaxed. And when Carolyn walked into the room he was in, wearing a pretty red dress and seemingly all the gold and diamonds she owned, Ken just stared and smiled. Ken finished getting ready, then took his wife's hand, and they walked outside together. They got into Ken's car, pulled out of their gated community, and set off on the 25-mile drive to San Juan Capistrano for their big birthday dinner date. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser, out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black, and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door. But he went around to the driver's side, and he saw right away the front window was smashed. And Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims. After getting Castillo's message, the sheriff's office assigned 2 veteran detectives, Joe Holmes and James McDonald, to lead the potential murder investigation. They arrived on the lonely stretch of road on Ortega Highway at about 1 a.m. The area was already alive, with crime scene technicians and sheriff's deputies gathering up evidence, photographing the victims, and just trying to make sense of the baffling scene. The deputies who were already at the scene informed Detectives Holmes and McDonald that the victims were indeed Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And based on the scene in the car, the deputies believed that Ken had been shot first and then Carolyn. Detective Holmes looked closely at the 2 bodies inside the car, and he thought the deputies were probably right. He thanked them for their help and then did an initial search of the car and the surrounding area. And honestly, Holmes was kind of impressed by how little physical evidence had been left behind at the scene. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no skid marks, no bullet casings, and no weapon. Whoever did this had been very thorough, leaving law enforcement with almost nothing to work with. But then Holmes and McDonald did an extensive examination of the bloody interior of the car, and they began to discover some clues. Carolyn was covered in expensive jewelry, and the only piece that was missing was a single earring that had fallen on the ground. Likewise, Ken had plenty of cash and credit cards in his wallet, but nothing of value had been taken, so this didn't look like a robbery. The 2 detectives saw that both victims had been shot multiple times from outside the car. 1 bullet had gone through the driver's side door, and the others through the open window. So this could not be a traditional murder-suicide either. Somebody else had fired 8 to 12 bullets into Carolyn and Ken and then left them for dead. To Holmes and McDonald, this honestly looked like a mob hit, and the shootings had a depressing familiarity to McDonald. In his years as a detective, he had investigated multiple murders on this highway, Ortega Highway. There was the farmhand who was found buried in a shallow grave, and the dead man in the trunk of an abandoned car. McDonald sometimes thought that Ortega Highway was pretty much just a place for killers to dispose of bodies. But he just couldn't begin to understand how 2 middle-aged, very successful doctors from a wealthy gated community could wind up slaughtered in this desolate place. Word that Carolyn and Ken had been gunned down on a rural mountain road near San Juan Capistrano immediately dominated the news. The seemingly random quality of the shooting sent a shiver across the whole region of Southern California where Carolyn and Ken lived, and it left Ken and Carolyn's family and friends almost speechless. No one could imagine somebody hating the couple so much that they needed to kill them. The owner of the eye care clinic where Carolyn practiced joked that Carolyn was so kind they deliberately gave her the grumpiest patients because she could always cheer them up. And Ken's colleagues spoke equally highly of him. A doctor who had served on a state board with Ken said that he was revered by other doctors for his wise medical judgment. And friends also pointed out that the couple worked all the time, often 6 days a week. Ken provided anesthesia for surgeries at multiple medical facilities, so he had a complex, unpredictable schedule. And Carolyn was so devoted to her practice that she had previously canceled vacation plans to avoid inconveniencing her colleagues. So their friends wondered when they would even have time to have made enemies. And early on, investigators struggled with the same question. On December 4th, so 2 weeks after the murders, hundreds of mourners crowded into St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Huntington Beach, California. They cried together, they comforted each other, and they celebrated Carolyn and Ken's lives. Ken's 87-year-old mother made her way to the front of the crowd. She said she had always braced herself for the possibility that her son might die young because of his bad heart, but nothing had prepared her for her son's violent end. Then she broke down in tears and said all she wanted to do was hold her son one more time. In the days following the funeral, Detectives McDonald and Holmes still didn't have much encouraging news for Ken and Carolyn's families, but their investigative team was still very busy. At a separate memorial service held for Ken by his colleagues, deputies had asked all the attendees to sign in a guest book. They wanted to know who was there, and they wanted to compare handwriting samples to documents they had collected from where Ken and Carolyn lived and worked to see if they could find anything connecting Ken's colleagues to the killings. But after a few weeks into the investigation, Holmes and McDonald still didn't have a suspect in mind, but they were getting a better picture of the killer. The autopsy confirmed that both Carolyn and Ken had been killed by multiple gunshots sometime between the hours of 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., so not long before Deputy Castillo had found the car. Also, a separate ballistics analysis found that all the gunshots came from a single gun, most likely a .357 Magnum revolver. That gave Holmes and McDonald a couple of key pieces of information. First, Ken and Carolyn were most likely murdered by a single gunman. And second, the killer was cold and collected. They had fired at least 8 shots from a revolver that held only 6 bullets, meaning the shooter had to stop in the middle of the murders, reload their weapon, and start firing again. Those reports forced Holmes and McDonald to think about the last minutes of Carolyn's life. Her husband was dead, and she was all alone in a cold, dark, strange place. Meanwhile, her killer was casually reloading their gun so they could shoot more bullets into her. I mean, this was a truly awful way to go. And that information pushed the detectives to dig even deeper into Carolyn and Ken's lives in the hope they would find something that would lead them to the killer. And in doing this deep dive, Holmes and McDonald soon discovered that Carolyn and Ken's 14-year marriage was not nearly as perfect as some of their grieving friends and relatives had thought. Some of the couple's loved ones had come forward and told the detectives that Carolyn and Ken had problems, a lot of problems. Carolyn's sister Linda actually reached out and asked to meet with the detectives. She said she didn't want to speak ill of the dead, but she really needed them to know the truth. And so, on a cool December day, Linda arrived at the sheriff's station, and she followed Holmes and McDonald into a small, comfortable office. And within a few seconds of sitting down, Linda went on an absolute tirade about her brother-in-law, Ken. She told the detectives that Ken had a history of cheating that began way before he even met Carolyn. Ken's first marriage had ended because Ken had an affair. Then, Ken had married the woman he had the affair with, but that marriage also fell apart within just 3 months. Linda said her sister Carolyn was well aware of Ken's romantic history when she had moved in with him back in 1984. But Carolyn was determined to make a better man of him. And after they had been living together for a year, Carolyn gave Ken an ultimatum: marry her, or the relationship would be over. Ken had told friends he never wanted to get married again, but he reluctantly gave in to Carolyn's demand. Linda said their marriage actually seemed to go pretty smoothly for a while. Carolyn was close with Ken's mother, and she was also close with Ken's son from his first marriage, and with 2 doctors' incomes, they made a ton of money, and so their future looked quite bright. Suddenly, Linda trailed off and just stopped talking. The detectives asked her if she needed a break, or if they could get her anything, but she said she did want to keep going. She needed to get this all out. Then Linda took a deep breath and composed herself, and told the detectives that things had taken a really bad turn for her sister about 5 years earlier. She said Carolyn had come home from visiting family in Michigan, and she found a woman she didn't know eating fast food on the couch in her living room. The woman was just as surprised as Carolyn, and she fled the house immediately, but Ken had admitted he was romantically involved with that woman. Linda said she had hoped her sister would just leave Ken right then and there, but she didn't. Instead of demanding a divorce, Carolyn had demanded marriage counseling. But even with marriage counseling, Ken's behavior didn't change. He had at least 3 more affairs that Linda said she was aware of, and she said his address book was still full of women's names and phone numbers. Linda clutched the arms of her chair tight, and she fought back tears while she talked about her sister. But she took a deep breath and continued her story. She told the detectives that she had been so angry at Ken that she finally confronted him about his chronic cheating and about how much he was hurting her sister. One of the detectives asked how Ken responded to that, and Linda gave a slight laugh and shook her head, and then she said Ken had just shrugged his shoulders and told her that, he was the person he was, and Carolyn just had to accept that. Finally, Linda told the detectives that Carolyn went to great lengths to hide the ugly truth about her marriage. Carolyn was always very careful to give the impression of marital bliss to friends and coworkers. She would even buy herself her own Christmas presents. She would wrap them and put tags on them that said they were from Ken, even though obviously they were not, and she would put them under the tree, and so that when friends and family came over, they would see how good Ken was being to his wife. And Ken just played along with this for the sake of appearances. Linda said one of the reasons Carolyn was buying all these gifts for herself is because she believed buying nice things for herself made her happy. She called it retail therapy. But Linda knew her sister better than anybody, and she knew no matter what Carolyn did, no matter what she bought, no matter how nice it was, nothing could change the fact that Ken had totally broken her heart. The detectives shared a look. Linda's retail therapy comment had just potentially cleared up a question they'd had for weeks. When they had searched Carolyn and Ken's home right after the murders, they found nearly $30,000 in brand new women's clothing and accessories. A lot of it was actually still wrapped in plastic, with the price tags still attached. That had really confused the detectives at the time, but now it kind of made sense. The detectives thanked Linda for all her help, and then they walked her out of the station. McDonald and Holmes hadn't let on in front of her, but Linda's revelations about Ken and Carolyn's troubled relationship opened up a world of potential murder suspects. Did a former girlfriend take revenge on Ken for leaving her? Or did a jealous husband of one of the women that Ken had an affair with lash out? There was even a chance that Ken had been the lone target of one of those jilted lovers or angry husbands, and Carolyn had just happened to be with him at the time of the murder. With this new information, the detectives now wanted to dig into all of Ken's communications with all the women he was potentially having affairs with. Like most doctors in the 1990s, Ken carried a pager, which is a small electronic device that buzzes and gives a phone number to call when somebody needs you. The detectives got Ken's pager and they contacted every phone number on it. This at least allowed them to reconstruct key parts of Ken's last day. The detectives found a fellow anesthesiologist who paged Ken around 8 p.m. on the night of the murder. This other anesthesiologist had hoped that Ken could cover for him at a surgery the next morning. The doctor said Ken sounded normal when they talked and that Ken was out celebrating his wife's birthday. So McDonald and Holmes reasoned that whatever happened to the couple that night probably caught them completely by surprise. McDonald also came across a Mexican immigrant named Adriana Vasco who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders. She explained that she had become friends with Ken several years earlier when she worked in the office at the National Pain Institute where he was a part-time anesthesiologist. Adriana said that Ken had agreed to get her desktop computer repaired, and she had paged him to find out how the repairs were going. McDonald was immediately suspicious of this. He couldn't understand why a busy doctor would be volunteering to repair computers on the side. The detective asked Adriana flat out if she was having an affair with Ken, but she denied it. Adriana insisted that Ken was just a very generous guy. He had helped her out financially numerous times over the years. The call with Adriana lasted only 5 minutes, but McDonald came away from it with the distinct sense that he had just been lied to. But he had no evidence to back up his gut feeling, so he let it drop, at least for the moment. Over the coming days, McDonald and Holmes repeatedly asked Ken's family and friends what they knew about Adriana Vasco. The detectives got nothing but blank stares. None of the friends or family had ever heard of her. Then, in late December, a woman contacted the detectives and admitted right at the start that she'd had an affair with Ken in the mid-1990s. And when she heard about the murders, she'd recalled a conversation she'd had with Ken back then. She said Ken had complained that he was being blackmailed by someone close to him and that he was not in control of his own life. The woman's story was chilling, and blackmail was not out of the realm of possibility. After all, Ken had had multiple affairs, and most people assumed he was rich because he was a doctor. But the detectives had also discovered that Ken's health issues had caused him to miss months of work in the past. That had led to some financial strain and had forced Ken and Carolyn to move out of their $700,000 home into the comfortable but much more modest condo where they had lived at the time of their deaths. The detectives also knew Carolyn had spent at least $30,000 on clothes and jewelry for herself. So now Holmes and McDonald wondered if the murders simply came down to money. Maybe Ken couldn't pay someone who was blackmailing him, so they killed him and his wife. But as 1999 came to an end, the detectives still had no major suspects. They had followed a bunch of different leads, but so far, nothing had paid off. However, both detectives had a strong feeling that cracking this case would begin with one of the women Ken had an affair with, and they thought that woman could be Adriana Vasco. Both detectives were confident she knew a lot more than she had told them, so it was time to have another conversation. On February 29, 2000, so over 3 months after the murders, detectives McDonald and Holmes met Adriana Vasco at her friend's house in Anaheim, California. Adriana was little, she was barely 5 feet tall, and she was quite thin. She was 33 years old and a single mother of 2 young kids. Over coffee at her kitchen table, Adriana told the detectives how she had become friends with Ken, a man who seemed to live in a completely different world than she did. She explained that Ken had noticed her walking with a limp when they were both working at the National Pain Institute. Ken had offered to inject pain medication into her back to correct the limp, but he told her it would be an ongoing procedure. At the kitchen table, Adriana took a sip of her coffee, and then a smile came across her face. She said she had agreed to the procedure, and as the pain injections continued, the two of them started getting a bit closer. Adriana said she had even begun calling him Ken instead of Dr. Stahl, and Ken had clearly taken a growing interest in Adriana's life. Then, when Adriana had split with her husband, Ken paid for her and her son to go live in a motel. When Adriana's car had broken down, Ken gave her money to buy a new one, a white Mazda. So Adriana told the detectives it became normal for her to turn to Ken for help because he was always so kind to her. And Adriana said that in return, she became a shoulder for Ken to cry on. He opened up to her about his unhappiness. He told her he hated the Orange County doctor's life. He thought it was totally phony. He said he had a lot more fun when he went to the beer and barbecue chicken restaurant, which was down the street from Adriana's apartment. Ken had even told Adriana at one point that she was his only real friend. Detectives McDonald and Holmes sat on the edge of their seats, wanting to ask Adriana again if she was actually romantically involved with Ken, but they held their tongues and just let her talk. Adriana continued and said that Ken's marriage had been empty for years. He complained about his wife's looks and her weight, and he said they mostly slept in separate bedrooms. Then Adriana began to cry. She apologized and said she was still in shock over Ken's death. She said when she found out he died, it was like her whole world had just collapsed. Ken was like her hero. Finally, after Adriana wiped the tears from her face, she looked across the table at the detectives, and she admitted that she had had an affair with Ken. And Ken's wife, Carolyn, knew about it. She told the detectives that about 3.5 years earlier, she had received a phone call from Ken, but the moment she answered, Ken quickly handed the phone off to his wife Carolyn, and Carolyn's message to Adriana was blunt: "Stay away from my husband." Adriana said she broke off the affair soon after getting that phone call. She knew Ken would never divorce his wife, and she didn't want to get hurt. But she and Ken had remained friends even when Adriana found a new romantic partner and even had a daughter with him. In fact, Adriana said that Ken would sometimes go out to dinner with Adriana's new guy. Also, Adriana said after they split up, Ken never tried to have sex with her again. And she told the detectives that she really believed that Ken and Carolyn had genuinely started to work on their marriage at the time they got killed. And when she had spoken to Ken on the day he was killed, Adriana said he sounded happier than he had in months. McDonald and Holmes had more questions for Adriana, but the coffees were long since cold and it was after 5 p.m., so they thanked her for her time and they headed for the door. By the summer of 2000, the sensational double murder that had once gotten so much media attention was increasingly in danger of going cold. McDonald and Holmes had come away from their interview with Adriana convinced that her grief over Ken's death was actually sincere. She was probably lying about the length of their affair, but the detectives couldn't see why Adriana would want Ken dead. He had been a ready source of money and support to her for years. So the hope that one of Ken's lovers would lead them to the truth about the murders began to fade, and the detectives hadn't found any evidence that Ken had been blackmailed by anybody. Holmes and McDonald continued to pursue every possible lead, and they re-interviewed anyone who seemed to be remotely connected to the case, but their investigation stalled. In the fall of 2000, about 10 months after the murders, McDonald and Holmes were reassigned to another unit, and two new detectives, Brian Heaney and Phil Villalobos, took over Carolyn and Ken's murder case. Initially, the two new detectives felt totally overwhelmed. Villalobos had only been a homicide detective for 2 weeks, and Heaney's experience was mostly just in narcotics. But as they began to dig through the huge case file, they realized that their predecessors, McDonald and Holmes, were likely overwhelmed too. But something caught Detective Villalobos' eye as he reviewed Ken's cell phone records from the day of his death. Ken had called the same number 4 times, and the calls were to the same person who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders, Adriana Vasco. So Villalobos and Heaney quickly decided to pick up where the previous detectives had left off, and they turned their focus to Adriana. And at 8 p.m. on October 11th, almost 11 months after the murders, Adriana arrived at the sheriff's station for another interview. But this time, she was not eager to help. Adriana insisted that on the day of Ken's murder, she had only contacted him to talk about those computer repairs, and that the conversation was so innocuous that she couldn't even remember anything else they talked about. The two detectives pressed Adriana hard to get her to say more. Villalobos even asked her straight out who killed Ken. But Adriana broke into tears and said she had no idea and genuinely could not remember anything substantive from their last conversation. The detectives would question Adriana really aggressively for several hours until finally it was clear she just didn't have anything else to say, so they let her go. But the detectives were not quite finished with Adriana. After she left, the detectives rushed outside after her and hopped in their car and followed her. After driving for several minutes, Adriana arrived at a house where the father of one of her children was waiting for her. Adriana and this man had split up, but they remained close for the sake of their daughter. The detectives watched Adriana with this man from a distance, and they began to develop a new theory. Maybe Adriana did have nothing to do with Ken's death, but maybe this man who she was with, the father of her daughter, had gotten jealous of her affair with Ken, and maybe he lashed out. And so now maybe Adriana was doing everything she could to protect him, really just so her young daughter would not be without her father. Villalobos and Heaney waited for Adriana to leave, and then after she had, they hopped out of their car, walked up to the front door, knocked, and then when the man came to the door, they led him to the front yard to question him. And to the detective's surprise, this man was completely open and asked how he could help. Villalobos told him that he was convinced someone close to Adriana had killed Ken and Carolyn Stahl, but the detectives didn't know who. The man said that made sense to him, and he understood why they would want to question him. But then this man said something that sent Villalobos and Heaney reeling. He told them that he had nothing to do with Carolyn and Ken's murders, but he had a pretty good idea of who probably killed them. Villalobos just stared at him and then asked him outright, okay, who's the killer? And the man would say one word, Tony. The detectives were caught off guard. In all those files from nearly a year-long investigation, the name Tony had never once come up. Now they had someone telling them a guy named Tony was probably the killer they had been looking for. The detectives followed up with a bunch more questions about who this Tony person was, and they would learn that Tony was Adriana's current boyfriend, and he was a handyman at her apartment building. He also had a long criminal rap sheet, he had a temper, and he loved guns. A few days later, Detective Heaney was waiting in an unmarked car outside the hospital where Adriana worked. Investigators had been trying to track down Adriana's boyfriend, Tony, but the man seemed to have disappeared. So Heaney wanted Adriana to help them find him. Eventually, Adriana walked outside, still dressed in her scrubs, and right away Heaney rushed up to her and caught her completely by surprise. He asked her point blank if she would take a polygraph test right now. He said the test was all set up at the local police station right around the corner. All she had to do was come with him. Adriana was clearly shocked and pretty angry with Heaney for surprising her like this, but she did go with him to the police station. During the polygraph test, Adriana faced round after round of very difficult questions from Heaney and Villalobos, and Adriana held her ground, denying any knowledge of the murders. But then, Heaney hit her with a surprise question. He asked if Tony was the killer. She tried to deny knowing Tony, but it was already too late. The detectives knew he was her boyfriend and that she was lying to them. So Heaney began asking rapid-fire questions about Tony. Where was he? Did he know Ken? But Adriana collected herself, and she insisted she had no answers for them. But the detectives were convinced Adriana was now the key to unlocking this case, and too many people had been working for too long on this investigation to let this opportunity slip away. And it turned out the detectives had one more surprise for Adriana. There was an outstanding warrant for her arrest for driving with a suspended license, and they were going to use that to lock her up for the night. Adriana begged to be allowed to go home to her kids, but the detectives handcuffed her and led her to a cell. Now they just had to find Tony. Even after being locked up, Adriana did not tell the detectives where her boyfriend Tony was. But her phone bill showed that she had repeatedly called a number in Greenville, North Carolina over the past couple of days, and Detective Villalobos had a hunch that those were calls to Tony. Villalobos sent a picture of Tony to local police in Greenville, and right away an officer in Greenville contacted him and said he recognized Tony. He told Villalobos that Tony actually went by the name Dennis Godley in Greenville, but the local cops just called him the Weasel because he was so good at eluding arrest. However, the officer in Greenville said he would still be able to lead Villalobos and his partner right to Tony. So Detectives Villalobos and Heaney headed right to the airport and took a flight from California to North Carolina. And while they were there, they did meet and interview Tony. However, he was totally uncooperative. He claimed that he had never been close to Adriana and that he had absolutely no role in the death of Ken and Carolyn Stahl. The detectives flew home feeling frustrated and with almost no new information, but their plan with Adriana had worked. After spending the night in jail and worrying she would not get to go home to her kids, she was now finally ready to tell the detectives everything she knew about Tony and everything she knew about Ken and Carolyn's murders. And by the time Adriana was finished talking, Detectives Villalobos and Heaney were ready to make arrests in a case that had now gone on for almost a year. Based on Adriana's jail cell interview and evidence collected by both teams of detectives throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Carolyn and Ken Stahl out on Ortega Highway on November 20th, 1999. On that November day, the killer sat in the passenger seat of a parked car not far from the restaurant in San Juan Capistrano, where Ken and Carolyn were celebrating Carolyn's birthday. The killer calmly loaded their .357 Magnum and made small talk with the driver. But the driver wasn't listening. They had their eyes focused on the road right outside of the restaurant. Then the driver suddenly told the killer to be quiet. Ken's Dodge Stratus had just pulled out onto the road. The driver waited to let Ken's car get a little further away. Then the driver started their car, pulled out onto the road, and followed Ken. The driver tracked Ken onto Ortega Highway. The highway was dark and oddly quiet. The driver gripped the steering wheel tight and closed in on Ken. Meanwhile, the killer just kept talking like nothing out of the ordinary was even happening. Then at some point, Ken's car pulled off the highway into the breakdown lane near an emergency phone box. The driver told the killer it was time to act. Then the driver hit the gas, raced by Ken's car, and then did a U-turn into the breakdown lane. The driver's headlights were now shining directly into Ken's windshield. The driver put the car in park, and then the killer casually stepped out of the car. The killer walked right up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass, and Ken rolled the window down. Ken was about to say something when the killer casually raised the .357 Magnum and fired. The bullet hit Ken behind the left ear and exited through his right eye. Carolyn began to scream from the passenger seat and tried to undo her seatbelt, but she was in shock and her hands were shaking and so she couldn't get free. The killer then fired another shot into Ken, and this time the bullet shredded his aorta, the body's main artery, and so blood sprayed all over the car and Ken slumped over, dead. Carolyn finally got her seatbelt off, but by this point, the killer stuck his gun through the open driver's side window and fired multiple shots point blank at Carolyn, hitting Carolyn in the chest. Carolyn screamed again and blood began to pour down her shirt, but she was still alive. So the killer aimed the gun at her and fired again, but they were out of bullets. So as Carolyn is sitting there slowly dying and screaming and looking at her dead husband, the killer walked back to the other car, They opened up the passenger side door, shouted something at the driver, and then grabbed extra ammunition from a bag on the floor. Then the killer calmly reloaded their gun and then turned back and began walking towards Ken's car again. By this point, the killer saw the passenger side door of the Dodge Stratus was now open. Carolyn tumbled out of the car, and one of her earrings fell to the ground. She was covered in blood and struggling to breathe, but she managed to brace herself against the back door of the car and stay on her feet. Carolyn looked around for any kind of escape route, but then she heard something behind her. She turned and saw the killer walking towards her with their gun raised. There was nowhere to go. In a last, desperate attempt to save herself, Carolyn dove back inside the car head first. One of her red shoes fell off as she struggled to pull herself across the front seat of the car over the body of her dead husband. She was trying to get to the driver's side so that maybe she could speed away and save herself. But the killer just walked to the open passenger door, aimed their gun at the back of Carolyn's head, and fired off 2 more shots. Carolyn fell over dead in Ken's lap. The killer leaned in to make sure both Ken and Carolyn were dead. Then they did a thorough sweep of the car and the road around it to make sure they picked up any stray evidence, like bullet casings. Finally, when the killer was satisfied, they walked back to the white Mazda that was still parked with its lights shining directly into Ken's car. Then the killer got back into the Mazda and looked over at the driver. And the driver was shaking and horrified. The killer told the driver to calm down and just get out of here. But the driver shouted at the killer that they were not supposed to kill Ken. The driver said she loved Ken, and Ken was actually the one who had paid them to murder his wife. It would turn out Adriana was the driver, and her boyfriend, Tony, had indeed pulled the trigger and killed Carolyn and Ken. But Ken had actually been the one who set the entire thing in motion. It turned out Ken had wanted his wife dead for a long time. He wanted to be free to have relationships with lots of women without any repercussions and just to live his life however he wanted. But Ken felt like he was reliant on Carolyn. She took care of him and she made a lot of money, so if his health issues kept him from working again, he would still be able to live well because of Carolyn. Ken went so far as to tell some people that Carolyn had control of his life, and it was like he was being blackmailed just to stay in the marriage, even though that was just not true. But finally, Ken told Adriana that he had just had enough, and he asked her to help him murder his wife. Adriana said her boyfriend Tony would be perfect for the job. He was good with guns and calm in any situation. So Ken paid Adriana and Tony $30,000 to carry out a hit on Carolyn. And Ken and Adriana hammered out all of the details, including the exact location on Ortega Highway where Ken would pull over and the murder would go down. On the day of the murder, Ken had contacted Adriana multiple times to let her know when he and Carolyn were heading to the restaurant, and then when they arrived, and then also when they were leaving. And Adriana and Tony had been waiting nearby to follow him to the spot they'd agreed on. But when it came time to actually do the job, Tony took things into his own hands. He didn't trust Ken, and he didn't want the middle-aged doctor around to pin the whole thing on him. So Tony decided to just kill Ken too. Carolyn was truly just an innocent victim. Her husband had plotted against her and had even tried to paint her as some kind of blackmailing monster. But Carolyn's friends and family knew that despite all of Ken's cheating, Carolyn still loved him, and she still believed they could repair their marriage. But Ken had no intention of doing that. At trial, Adriana insisted that she tried to talk Ken out of going through with the shooting, and that she ultimately only went along with it because she was afraid of Tony. But ultimately, a jury would convict her of masterminding the entire murder plot and sentenced her to life in prison without parole. As for Tony, he would ultimately plead guilty to the murders in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. And Tony would insist to the very end that Adriana was the one who shot Carolyn, not him. Right in the middle of the United States is a quiet little town called Millstadt, Illinois. Millstadt is home to about 4,000 people, and had it not been for Ashley Reeves, only those 4,000 people and their friends and family would even know that Millstadt existed. In 2006, Ashley Reeves was a 17-year-old high school student who lived with her parents and her younger sister Casey in Millstadt. Ashley was an excellent student who, even though she was over a year from her high school graduation, she was already thinking about what colleges she wanted to go to. She was also extremely likable and outgoing, and she had this huge, infectious smile. And so she had tons of friends, and she had a very serious boyfriend who her parents adored. His name was Jeremy, and he was a high school student as well. On the morning of Thursday, April 27th of that year, Ashley got up and, like every other morning, she got ready for school alongside her sister Casey. And then right before Ashley stepped out to head off to school, she told her parents that after school, she had a job interview on the other side of town. And then after her interview, her plan was to play basketball with some friends and then she'd be home. And so her parents said, okay, well, hey, good luck with your job interview and just make sure you're home before 10:30 p.m. And so Ashley said, no problem, I'll see you tonight, and then she left. That afternoon, after school, Ashley made her way to Jeremy's locker, and when she got to him, Jeremy handed her his keys to his car. He had an SUV, and he was lending it to her for the day so she could go to the interview and then go play basketball. And so Ashley took the keys, she thanked him, she gave him a hug, and then she turned and she walked down the hallway where she met up with her sister Casey at her locker. And then the two girls left the school, they went out to the student parking lot, they found Jeremy's SUV, they hopped inside, and then Ashley began driving them back to their house. When they got there, Casey hopped out of the car, she said bye to Ashley, and then Ashley left their house and she began driving to Fairview Heights, which was a town about 15 miles away where her interview was going to be. Several hours later, around 10 p.m., Ashley's parents had not heard from their daughter, and it was getting close to her curfew, and so they asked Casey if she had spoken with Ashley, and, did she know how her interview went? Did she know when she was going to be home? But Casey would tell them, actually, no, I haven't talked to Ashley since she dropped me off from school. And so Ashley's parents said, okay, no big deal, and they called Ashley, but Ashley didn't pick up. So they sent her a series of text messages, but after a couple of minutes of not getting any response, they decided to just call her boyfriend Jeremy to see if maybe he knew what was going on with Ashley. But when they spoke to Jeremy, he would say that, I haven't spoken with Ashley since I gave her the keys to my SUV, and I've actually been trying to talk to her all day. I've been calling her and texting her, but I still haven't heard back. And so at this point, Ashley's parents were starting to get really worried. And so after hanging up with Jeremy, they began calling other friends of Ashley's to see if maybe they had spoken to her and knew what was going on. But all of her friends that they spoke to all had the same story. We haven't talked to her since the end of school and she's not returning our calls or texts. And so Ashley's mother, she just sensed that something was terribly wrong. And so without any hesitation, she just called the police. Now, the police in this town were used to getting calls every now and again from parents whose teenage child had run off and they were concerned about them, but virtually every time the police investigated, they would find the teenager had just kind of been blowing off their friends and family, and they would pop up maybe a couple hours later totally unharmed. But the Millstadt police would later remark when they heard Ashley's mother's voice over the phone, the fear in her voice was so pronounced, it immediately pushed the police department to take this case very seriously. And so that night, right after this phone call, the Millstadt Police Department went out in force to try to locate Jeremy's SUV, the car that Ashley had been driving around that day. And the first place they went to look for this car was Latterman Park, which is this very popular public park that has a really popular basketball court that lots of teenagers would go to all the time, and Ashley was known to frequent that park. And this park was located about halfway between Fairview Heights, where her interview was, and Millstadt, where she lived. And so they go to Latterman Park, and right away, sitting in the parking lot, they find Jeremy's SUV. But Ashley is not in the car, she's nowhere near the car, and when they searched the car, there was nothing of significance inside of it. There was just some of Ashley's clothes lying around. The police would spend all night and well into the morning combing Latterman Park looking for any sign of Ashley, but there wasn't one, and so as the sun came up and the police were nowhere closer to finding this girl, they began to suspect that, perhaps foul play was involved. And so the first person they hauled in for questioning was Ashley's boyfriend, Jeremy. But as soon as he sat in the interrogation room, he demonstrated a real concern for Ashley, he had a rock-solid alibi, and he basically was an open book, and so they quickly ruled him out as a suspect. And then the police basically began hauling in all of Ashley's friends and acquaintances and family members, basically anybody that knew her. They were bringing them into the station to find out if they knew anything that could help them figure out where Ashley was. And more specifically, the police were really looking to see if any of these people were hiding something. And sure enough, a few of the friends that were brought in were. According to a few of Ashley's closest friends, Ashley was in not one, but two romantic relationships. One was the public relationship she had with Jeremy, and the other was a secret relationship that was actually illegal. In order to hide this forbidden second relationship, Ashley would tell her family and her friends that she was going to the park to play basketball, when in reality, she was going to the park to meet up with this secret second partner. And the day before, when Ashley went missing, her friends told police that that was the exact reason she was going to Latterman Park. The police got the name of this secret person from Ashley's friends. His name was Sam Shelton, and the police tracked him down. When they found him, he was at a baseball practice, but the police didn't care. They marched right on to the baseball diamond, and they grabbed Sam and they brought him back to the police station. And then when he got there, they sat him down in the interrogation room, and he's still wearing his baseball uniform, and they asked him about his relationship with Ashley. And he immediately denies it and says he does not have a relationship with Ashley. He's got no idea why he's here. But pretty quickly, after a few questions, Sam's answers became inconsistent. And so the police just ratcheted up the pressure on him. And then finally, after 12 hours of questioning, the interrogator brings up Sam's mother and his grandmother. And he says to Sam, how would they feel if they knew you were lying to the police right now? And this just broke Sam. And so he cracked. Now, at this point, the police were already expecting the worst when it came to Ashley, but they were not ready for just how brutal Sam's confession would be about what exactly he did to her. The following is an account based on his confession. 30 hours earlier, Ashley wrapped up her interview in Fairview Heights, and she made her way to Latterman Park to meet up with Sam. And now it's not clear exactly how they met up, but eventually the two of them did connect and they made their way over to Sam's car where they became intimate. Afterwards, the two are sitting in the front two seats of Sam's car. Sam is in the driver's seat and Ashley is in the passenger seat. And while they're sitting there, something happens that causes this huge fight between the two of them. And at some point, Sam tells Ashley to get out of the car. But Ashley refuses. She wants to talk to him. She wants to deal with their issues, but Sam's not having it. And so he gets so mad at her that he lunges across the center console of the car and he puts Ashley into a vicious chokehold. Now, he tells police his plan was to kind of yank her out of the car, but he squeezed so hard around her neck that he heard this loud popping sound coming from her neck. It was the sound of her neck breaking. And so as soon as he heard it, Sam let go, and Ashley kind of crumpled forward and hit the front dashboard of the car. And so Sam is staring at her, wondering what he should do. He's kind of looking around, making sure no one saw what he just did. And then he reached over and lifted her back up to see if she was still alive, and he saw she was. But instead of trying to get her help, he decides right then and there he's going to kill her. And so he reaches over and he begins choking her. But after several minutes of throttling her, she just wouldn't die. And so Sam pulled his belt off of his waist and he wrapped it around Ashley's neck. And then he began pulling. But he would tell police he couldn't stand looking at Ashley's face while he did this. He said she was staring right at him, her tongue was coming out of her mouth, she was frothing, and her face was turning this ghastly shade of gray-blue. And so at some point, when she still hadn't died, he released the belt from around her neck, and he turned her body so she was facing the window away from him, and then he repositioned the belt on her neck, and then he put his foot on her back to use as leverage, and then he pulled as hard as he possibly could on her throat for quite a while until the belt actually broke around her neck. And then at that point, he checked to make sure she was dead, and when she was, he stuffed her down into the floorboards in front of the passenger seat, and then he drove several miles across town to another park called Citizens Park that was very heavily forested. And once he parked in the parking lot, he looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then he dragged Ashley's body out of the car and deep into the woods where he abandoned her. It would turn out Ashley was far from the only teenage girl who found Sam Shelton attractive. Many teenage girls in the area thought he was the perfect catch. He was smart, he was handsome, and he had these beautiful, striking blue eyes that you couldn't help but just stare at. However, there was something unique about Sam that made him fundamentally different than all the other guys at their schools. Sam was not a student. He was a 27-year-old middle school teacher in Millstadt, and he also was the high school baseball coach. He had never been Ashley's teacher directly. However, years earlier when she was in middle school, he had begun grooming her for exploitation. And so fast forward to 2006 when she was 17, he had effectively manipulated her into believing she was in this romantic relationship with him, when in reality, he was just using his position of power to abuse her. In addition to being a school teacher, Sam was also an aspiring pro wrestler. He would often compete in local showcases under the nickname The Teacher. While Sam was probably nowhere near good enough to actually become a professional wrestler like you would see on TV, he was extremely strong and really knew how to do a chokehold. And so when he attacked Ashley and put her in that vicious chokehold, she had no chance at escaping. She was completely doomed. Shortly after his confession, Sam would tell the police that he would take them out into the forest of Citizens Park to try to find Ashley's body. But when they got there, it was late, it had been raining for several hours, and Sam right away acted like he couldn't figure out exactly where he had left her. And so the police were actually starting to think, is he lying to us? Is this whole thing just kind of made up? Did he really attack her? Is she really out here? But after about 30 minutes of the police and Sam kind of trudging around the thick forest, one of the officers suddenly sees something on the ground. He raises his flashlight, and there in a clearing is Ashley's body. And so the police and Sam, they walk over to her, and they're standing above her ruined body. Her neck is totally bent at a grotesque angle. She's covered in bugs. But as they're standing there and they're watching her, her chest suddenly starts to move. She wasn't dead. She had been left for dead, and she had been out in the woods with a broken neck for 30 hours in the freezing cold and the rain. She only had a t-shirt and some pants on, but she was alive. And so moments later, the paramedics, they come rushing into the forest, they pick her up really gently, they bring her out, and they rush her to the hospital where she'd be put into a medically induced coma. The doctors would tell her family that, unfortunately, her injuries were just too serious, and we don't expect her to ever wake up again. But miraculously, she would. Now, she would have to relearn how to walk and talk and eat and drink, but she would do all of those things, and today she is 32 years old, she is happily married, she has 2 kids of her own, and by and large, she leads a very happy, normal life. As for Sam Shelton, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder, and he's still in prison today. However, he is up for parole in 2024. The next and final story of today's episode is called What Happened in Room 348. On September 15, 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas to start his work week. As a young man, Greg had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea. But in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was Greg's job to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit-looking despite the fact that he never exercised and he smoked constantly. He kept a close-cropped white beard, and he had the leathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always rent him a room. The hotel itself was neither good nor bad, but to Greg, he didn't care. He just needed a bed and a TV. Once Greg walked inside, he had a bathroom immediately to his right, and then a little bit farther in was the main section of the hotel room, which was very basic. Straight ahead there was a window that looked down onto a small pool that was lined with potted plants, and then in the main space was a queen-size bed tucked up against the right wall, and then on the left wall was a TV. Greg wheeled his one suitcase into the hotel room, and he put it at the foot of the bed, and he opened it up. He pulled out the shirts that he wanted to keep wrinkle-free for the week, and he hung them in his closet. Then he pulled out his toiletries that were kept in a cloth bag with a hook, and he hooked those onto a towel rack. Then he took off his very worn brown boots and his faded blue jeans, and he slipped on some pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs, but he wasn't a big drinker or socializer. He preferred to just have quiet nights alone in his room watching TV. So that night, Greg cranked the air conditioning to make sure it was as cold as it could get. He liked to sleep in a very cold room. And then he hopped on his bed and he put 2 big pillows behind his head and he rested up against the headboard. And then he took a towel and he laid it out next to him. And on the towel was his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter, his phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Then he picked up the TV remote, turned it on, flicked through the channels until he landed on one that was playing Iron Man 2, and he thought, good enough. Put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, opened it up, he ate a piece of his candy, and then he grabbed a cigarette, lit up a cigarette, and he began smoking. The following morning, Susie, Greg's wife, did not get a call from her husband. And he always called her every morning that he was gone. That was their routine, and this was a big break from their routine. And so she tried calling him, and his phone rang and rang and rang, and he never picked up. And so then she called his Beaumont office, and he didn't pick up. But after the second or third time she called, his coworkers picked up the phone, and they said, hey, Greg's not here. He hasn't come into work yet. And Susie felt concerned. She felt like something was wrong. And she said, do you guys mind just going to his hotel room and knocking on his door and making sure he's okay? And they said, sure, we'll go over there. So the two coworkers head over to the hotel. They knock on Greg's door. He doesn't answer. And so they go down and get the manager, who comes up and opens Greg's door. And right away, they find Greg lying dead in the middle of his hotel room. The way Greg was positioned when they found him, it looked like he had fallen to his knees and then fallen again onto his face, and his left arm got kind of tucked underneath his body, and still in his two left fingers was a cigarette that had not fallen from his hand but had burned down to the wick. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin was grayish blue. Immediately after seeing Greg, the two coworkers called 911. Shortly after the ambulance arrived at the hotel, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Apple was a short guy, very, very fit. He had silver hair that he spiked up. He looked 100% cop, and he worked basically 24/7. When he got up to room 348, there was no sign of a break-in, nothing had been disturbed inside of the room, and there was no blood or obvious wound on Greg, with the exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek when he came down and hit his face on the rug. He looked around the room and he found Greg's wallet that was sitting in the back pocket of his jeans, and there was hundreds of dollars in his wallet that had not been taken, so he ruled out robbery. He went out into the hall and he began interviewing the other occupants of the surrounding rooms, and no one had heard anything and no one had seen anything. He went back into the hotel room and he began looking around for drugs of any kind or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have contributed to his death, and there was nothing. No prescription pills, no alcohol, nothing. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple, and she said, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a young teenager, and he never saw a doctor, and I always told him that if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something. So at this point, not only does Greg's family think he died of natural causes, Detective Apple also thinks the same thing. He's thinking about what he saw in the hotel room, and there's no sign of any foul play. It just looks like a guy whose lifestyle caught up to him. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, who in Beaumont, Texas, he was like the medical examiner. He'd been doing this for years and years. Dr. Brown had read ahead that they believed Greg had died of a heart attack or something like that. And when his body was wheeled in front of him, there was nothing he saw right away that contradicted that theory. The only two marks that the doctor noted on the outside of Greg's body was the small abrasion on his face from where he landed on the rug, and then he also had another small abrasion on his crotch. But beyond that, the rest of his body was completely unblemished. When he looked inside of his body, it looked like someone had literally just crushed his insides. His torso was full of blood, food from his intestines had been ripped outside, he had ribs broken, internal organs were lacerated, and there was a hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was really confused at what he was looking at, because the severity of Greg's internal injuries were more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or who had had a really heavy object land on them, but Greg didn't have any significant external injuries that would support either of those two things happening to him. And he was found in the middle of a hotel room where there was nothing disturbed and no one had apparently seen or heard anything. And so Dr. Brown says, look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not natural. This is a homicide, and my best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't really make sense because there's not any external injuries, but he suffered some significant trauma from somebody else, and that's what killed him. When Detective Apple got this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was, but his attention turned to, okay, well, if he's been murdered, who would want to murder him? And he began digging into Greg's background, and he found that he was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He kept to himself. He was in love with his wife, and his wife loved him back. There was no evidence of some scandal in the background. He was just this really nice, normal guy, and it didn't make any sense why anybody would want to kill him. After a few months of getting nowhere, and in reality, he hadn't really even gotten started because there wasn't any good starting point. The only thing he could find that was odd about the crime scene was that the room was particularly warm when they walked inside, which was not in keeping with how Greg would have kept the room. But that doesn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so he's gotten nowhere, and then he makes a discovery. He found in the hotel's maintenance logs on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his microwave and managed to blow a fuse. And it wasn't just his power. Maybe Greg didn't know this, but he cut the power to both the room next to him on his right and on his left and below him. And so he calls down to the front desk, and a maintenance guy came up and he reset the breaker. This opened the door to two theories. The first theory is the maintenance guy, who did have a criminal record, when he came up to fix the breaker, he attacked Greg. But that was wildly speculative, and there was no evidence to suggest that the maintenance guy would do that, and so that was quickly ruled out. The other theory was Greg's neighbors in room 349 were these two electricians who were big partiers and drinkers, and so Detective Apple suggested that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they were really annoyed, and they went outside in the hall and they saw Greg, and they somehow realized he was to blame for this, and in a drunken rage, they attacked him and killed him, and that's what killed Greg. And even though it was a stretch, it was the closest thing to a motive Detective Apple had found in anyone. And so Detective Apple put on a hidden camera and he went and interviewed these two electricians that were still staying in room 349. And he said when he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed very honest. They were appropriately curious about what happened to Greg. And all they said was, look, we had no interaction with him. We did hear him coughing when we came back from the bar. We were at the bar that night, but honestly, that's the extent of our interaction with him. The electricians offered up their cell phone numbers, their email addresses, and said, anything you need from us, we'd be happy to help. We're really sorry this happened. At this point, Detective Apple is back to square one. No one knows what happened to this guy. The one big lead he had, the maintenance records, proved to be a total dead end. And so unfortunately, this case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, where there had been absolutely no traction on figuring out what happened to him, Susie, Greg's wife, decided she wanted to hire a private investigator. And her friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, who was a famous private detective who was well known for being able to solve really complex cases. And so on a whim, Susie calls Ken Brennan, not expecting to get through to him, thinking he's probably super busy and has other cases because he's on TV and he's this really famous guy. But he picked up the phone and he was like, hey, how can I help you? And Susie couldn't believe it. She had a chance to tell him about what happened to her husband. And Ken said he was really interested and that he would take on the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop and he was a DEA special agent. He spoke with a really thick New York City accent and he wore t-shirts that were a little bit too small to show off his muscles, and he usually had a big gaudy gold chain on. Once Ken agreed to take on this case, he flew right to Lafayette, Louisiana, where Susie lived. He sat down and he asked her a lot of really difficult questions about their marriage, about whether she thought he might be cheating on her, if he had like a secret life she didn't know about. And after feeling satisfied that all those avenues had been explored and were not going to lead to the answer, he said, okay, well, can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Is there anything about it that seems off? And Susie said, yeah. Greg always kept the air conditioning on very cold at night. He never slept in a room that wasn't freezing cold. And so I thought it was really odd when his coworkers discovered him that the air conditioning was off and it was really hot inside of the room. That's incredibly unlike Greg for his air conditioning to be off. Ken made a note of this, and then he left Lafayette and he went to Beaumont, Texas to meet up with Detective Apple. And Detective Apple and he actually got along really well. They agreed to work together on this case because Detective Apple feels like he's reached a dead end anyways. Apple brought Ken to the crime scene, he showed him the hotel room, and then afterwards he turned over all of the documents he had on the case, from the autopsy report to the photographs to anything he'd collected over the 7 months he'd been working on it. So that night, Ken diligently looks through all of the documentation, all of the photos, and the next day when he goes into Apple's office, he says to him, I think I figured it out. And Apple's like, oh really, you figured it out one day after being here? And Ken's like, no, seriously, I think I figured it out. I have to confirm something with his wife, but I think I have a theory. And so Ken calls Susie right in front of Apple, and when Susie picks up, Ken's like, hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand or did he smoke with his right hand? And Susie said, oh no, he only smoked with his right hand. And Ken goes, thank you very much. He hangs up and he goes, Apple, I got it. And so Apple's like, okay, what's your theory? And Ken says, okay, so I spoke to Susie and she told me it was very strange that his room was not air conditioned when they discovered his body, because Greg was known for always turning on the air conditioning to as cold as it can get, especially at night when he went to bed. And so when his power went out the night before, his air conditioning would have gone out. And so the maintenance guy comes up, turns the power back on, but it doesn't trigger the air conditioning to turn back on. The room is still cold from having been air conditioned all evening to that point. And so the TV is back on, and so perhaps Greg turns and just starts watching TV. Because the room feels air conditioned, he hasn't realized that he hasn't turned the air conditioning back on again. Now, this is Beaumont in the summer, so it's going to get really hot in his room really quickly, and as soon as it starts to warm up in there, he's going to realize, oh, I didn't turn the AC back on, and he would go over and turn it on again. And so because the air conditioning wasn't on, and we know that the power was restored at 8:30, then he must have died after the power was on, but before it got warm enough in the room for him to recognize he did not turn the AC on, which means he would have died somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. at night. And so Apple's like, wow, that's pretty impressive, except that doesn't really help us figure out how he died or who killed him. And Ken puts his hand up and he says, I know, I'm just building the whole picture here. Okay, so we have him dying between 8:30 and 9, and I don't think he was beaten to death. I think a lot of people want that to be what killed him because it's kind of the only thing that might make sense, but I say it definitely doesn't make sense because of the cigarette. Now, we found that cigarette in his left hand, and I talked to his wife, and she said he only smokes in his right hand. And so what I think happened is the power came back on at about 8:30, which is what the report says. The TV turns back on. Greg doesn't turn the air conditioning back on. He sits on his bed. He's watching TV. He lights up a cigarette and he's smoking with his right hand. And then something happens to him, which I'll get into my theories on that. And he jumps off the bed and he starts making his way to the door to get help. And he transfers the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his right hand to turn the doorknob and open the door to safety. But he doesn't make it. He falls to his knees and he falls to the ground and his cigarette's still in his fingers and he dies. And Apple's like, you know what? That's pretty good. It makes a lot of sense. But the crucial missing piece here is, well, what was the trauma he suffered that caused him to jump from his bed and run to the door and then ultimately die? Ken's like, I got a theory on that too, but I got to be in the hotel room to see if it's true. So Apple and Ken go back to the hotel room. When they get there, Ken goes inside and he starts walking around, looking at the ceiling, the wall, the ground. And then finally he stops when he's looking back towards the front door leading back into the hall. And he points at the wall and he says, there. And Apple looks at what he's pointing at, and it looks like there had been some patchwork on the wall in the same spot where the doorknob, when it swings open, would hit the wall. And so Apple's looking at it and he's like, that's just from the doorknob. And so Ken takes the door and he opens it all the way to where the doorknob is pressed against the wall, and it's to the right of this patchwork, meaning this patchwork is not connected to the doorknob. Apple was confused and was about to ask questions, and Ken was like on a roll, and he said, hold on, and he goes outside, he goes next door to room 349, they go inside, and Apple walks in the room and he's watching Ken do his work, and Ken's rubbing his hands all over the wall, and eventually he stops, and he looks up at Apple, and he takes his finger, and he pushes on one spot in the wall as Apple is watching, and his finger goes right in. And what he pushed on was this little chunk of toothpaste that had been wedged in this little tiny hole in the wall, and he pushed it through. Apple brought in a crime scene investigations unit who carefully excavated both sides of this wall, and they shined a laser from 349 into Greg's room, and the trajectory of the laser going through this hole lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting on the bed, smoking cigarettes, eating candy, watching a movie. So Ken and Apple go back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and they say, look, you missed something because Greg got shot. And unfortunately, Greg's body had already been cremated, but they did have the pictures to look at from the autopsy. And sure enough, they find that little tiny laceration in his crotch was actually an entrance wound. And then when Dr. Brown pointed out there was a hole in the heart, it kind of lined up with the trajectory that bullet would have been traveling through his body. Dr. Brown realized he had made a mistake, and he changed the autopsy report to reflect a gunshot wound. Ken and Detective Apple re-interviewed one of the electricians that had been in room 349 that was in the room where the gunshot had originated from. His name was Lance. And when they brought him in, they said, this is totally routine. You know, it's been 7+ months since Greg's death. And what we're doing is any of our witnesses, we want them to sign a statement, basically attesting that this is what I saw or didn't see. And so they had prepared a statement that basically lined up with the first thing he had told police, which was, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. And they said, is there anything you want to change about your story? Or is this exactly what you saw and heard? And Lance said, yeah, that's exactly, I don't know anything. I wish I knew more, I'm sorry. And like, all right, well then can you sign this document saying that you don't know anything and you didn't see anything? And he said, yeah. He signs the document, and then Ken's like, all right, gotcha, because we know a gunshot was fired from your room, and that's what killed Greg. And so you need to tell me who shot the gun, otherwise I'm taking you to jail for submitting a false police report. At this point, Lance crumbles and the truth comes out, and he said that he and the other electrician in the room with him, whose name was Muller, they were goofing around and drinking that night, and Muller went out and got his pistol from his car, and he brought it in, and he was goofing around with it, and Lance was saying that he was trying to get him to stop doing that, but he kept goofing around with the gun, and at one point, he aimed the gun at Lance, and Lance kind of batted it away from him. He dropped the gun, it landed, and it went off, and they saw where the bullet hole was. They saw it was into Greg's room, and they both froze, and they listened to see if anybody had reacted to this gunshot. And he said they didn't hear anything for a long time, and that made them believe that no one was in the other room, that no one was in Greg's room, and that they were in the clear. And so they left and went to the bar. They didn't even think to check on whoever was in that room. And when they came back, they said they heard Greg coughing in his room, and that further confirmed that he must not have been in there when they fired the shot, and he's totally fine, and they are totally in the clear. The next day, Lance said when they saw his body being taken out, at first they did think, oh my goodness, this is us. We did this. But they overheard Detective Apple walking around interviewing people saying out loud that, yeah, we think this is natural causes. Yep, looks like a heart attack. This is probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing. And they were like, oh, phew, it's not us. And so they actually believed it was just a coincidence that on the same day they're firing a rogue bullet into Greg's room, that Greg had a heart attack and died separately. But Lance would say that somewhere in the back of both of their minds, they knew they probably had something to do with it, and so they covered their tracks, and they put toothpaste in the wall to cover up the hole, and they hid the gun, and they intentionally kept information from the police. And so ultimately, Muller, the owner of the gun, the one who really instigated that night, waving the gun around, and the one who actually dropped the gun, he was charged with manslaughter and was given 10 years in prison.